The wind had teeth that winter, sharp enough to bite through bone and memory. Snow had swallowed Dust Vale whole, leaving only chimney smoke and church bells to remind folks they were still alive. The streets were pale and empty, except for one figure trudging through the frost. Her shawl was thin, her boots cracked, her face ruddy from the cold. That was Clara May Hensley, the widow who once baked the best honey biscuits west of the Pecos, now a ghost moving through her own life. She carried a small parcel under her arm, a loaf she hadn't sold, wrapped in old paper. At the corner of Main, two women paused their conversation to watch her pass. Miss Hattie Griggs, the seamstress, leaned in to whisper something behind her glove. Clara didn't turn, but she heard the words anyway, carried clear by the wind. "No one marries a fat widow, sir. Not in this town." The sting of it burned worse than the frost. Clara didn't hate them. Pity clung to her more cruelly than mockery ever could. It wasn't that she had gained weight. Grief had simply settled into her like an unwelcome tenant. Her husband, Harold, had died the previous spring when his wagon overturned in a flood. The river had taken him and left her with debts, whispers, and an empty bakery that smelled faintly of yeast and sorrow. She pushed open the door to Sheriff Cole Ransom's office, hoping, perhaps foolishly, for a job sweeping floors or delivering letters. The sheriff looked up, half surprised, half bored, his pipe smoke coiled in the air. "Mrs. Hensley," he said, voice low, almost kind. "Men can barely feed themselves these days. Ain't much to offer." "I can work," she replied softly. Her words were steady, though her hands trembled. He sighed. "Work's for them who can take orders, ma'am. You best ask the church." Clara nodded once. She knew that tone. It was the kind men used when they were done listening. By dusk, she sat by her cold hearth, staring at the fire that refused to catch. The last of her woodpile was gone. From her window, she could see the bakery's new owner sweeping the steps, laughter spilling out with the warm light. She whispered to herself, "But I can work." And the words came out like a prayer. The next morning brought no mercy. Snow fell thick and slow, and Clara's breath formed ghosts before her lips. She gathered her courage, wrapped her shawl tighter, and went to the tavern to ask if anyone needed help. The place smelled of sweat, whiskey, and old pine. Rough men huddled by the stove, faces red from cold and ale. That's when she saw him, tall, still, sitting in the corner with a hat pulled low and eyes that had seen too much. He rose quietly, leaving coins on the counter, and pinned a note to the tavern wall. "Help wanted. Cook and hand." His gloved fingers lingered a moment before he turned to leave. No one spoke to him. The door shut softly behind his shadow. The men at the bar chuckled. "Who's gonna ride out there in this weather?" one snorted. "Boone's got ice for blood." Another spat into the fire. "He's mad to think anyone'll go near that ranch." Clara stepped closer, reading the note twice. The letters swam a little. Her hands were shaking. Cook and hand. 2 words. A chance. A heartbeat of hope in all that white silence. That night, she barely slept. She thought of the stories folks told about Elias Boone, the cowboy who kept to himself, whose family died in a barn fire years ago. They said he lived out by Dead Creek, that he never smiled, that he spoke only when he had to. Some said the fire hadn't killed his heart, just buried it under ash. By dawn, Clara packed her loaf of bread, the last of her courage, and started toward the horizon. The wind howled, the snow rising like ghosts around her skirt. Every step was a question. What am I doing? But the echo inside her answered, working, surviving. The trail wound through bare cottonwoods until a lonely ranch appeared, gray, quiet, half swallowed by snowdrifts. Smoke curled from the chimney, a promise of warmth. She knocked once, twice. The door creaked open. Elias Boone stood there, tall and lean, his eyes the color of cold water. A scar ran from his temple to his jaw, faint but deep enough to tell stories. "What do you need?" he asked. "I saw your note," Clara said, voice barely above a whisper. "No one marries a fat widow, sir, but I can work." For a moment, nothing moved. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then he stepped aside, motioning her in. Coffee's on, he said simply. We'll talk after you warm up. The cabin smelled of pine and smoke. She sat near the fire, holding the tin mug between both hands, its heat seeping into her bones. Boone studied her from across the room. Not cruelly, not kindly, just seeing her. It was the first time in months anyone had looked at her without flinching. I can cook, mend, tend horses if you need, she said. Can you ride? Not well, he nodded. Then you'll learn. It wasn't much of a conversation, but when he handed her a folded blanket and pointed to the spare room, it felt like the world had cracked open enough for a sliver of mercy to slip through. The days that followed were quiet. Clara rose before dawn, her breath clouding the frosted window as she cooked oats and eggs. Boone would already be outside, chopping wood, his rhythm steady and patient. When he returned, she'd pour coffee without words. Sometimes he'd nod, in thanks. Sometimes he'd just take his cup and stare at the snow. Silence became their shared language. She learned that he whistled softly to his horses, that he read from a weathered Bible at night, but never the same passage twice. Once, when she burned a batch of cornbread, he said without looking up, "You can't rush a fire. It burns when it's ready." She knew he wasn't talking about cornbread. One evening she caught him watching her mend his coat by the hearth. The air between them held a quiet, fragile peace. Then, unexpectedly, he slid his half-eaten stew toward her. "You didn't eat much," he said. She wanted to refuse, but her stomach betrayed her with a soft growl. He pretended not to hear it. She took the bowl. Their hands brushed, rough skin against soft. Neither spoke again. When she ventured into town for supplies, the world's cruelty returned with sharp precision. Hattie Griggs was at the general store, her voice carrying like the squeak of a rusty hinge. "Living with Boone now, are you, Clara May? My, how quick winter turns women desperate." Laughter rippled through the room. Clara said nothing. She paid for flour and salt, lifted her chin, and walked out into the snow. But that night, her hands shook as she mended a tear in Boone's shirt. He noticed. "They talk because they're cold inside," he said finally. She smiled weakly. "Doesn't make the air any warmer." He looked at her then. Really looked. "You don't owe anyone your sorrow." Something softened in her chest. She nodded, though tears welled in her eyes. "Maybe not. But sometimes it spills out anyway." That night, after he'd gone to bed, she stood by the window watching the snow fall in slow, steady flakes. Each one seemed to whisper a secret she almost understood. She touched the fogged glass, her reflection blurred, a woman no longer defined by pity or loss, but by the quiet pulse of endurance. Outside, the moon rose pale over the white fields. Inside, the fire crackled low, the cabin warm with the faint scent of pine and bread. Clara closed her eyes and let the stillness hold her. For the first time in months, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. The narrator's voice, soft as drifting snow, might have said, "Sometimes, winter isn't for dying, it's for beginning again." And though she didn't know it yet, the storm outside was only half over. The other half was waiting to break inside her heart. Winter lingered longer than anyone expected. The snow no longer fell in angry gusts, but in slow, thoughtful flakes, as if the sky itself had grown weary of cruelty. Clara May had learned the rhythm of the ranch, the creak of the barn doors at dawn, the sigh of horses before feeding, the quiet hum of Elias Boone's presence nearby. What had begun as labor became something gentler, a companionship without words. She no longer asked permission to fix things, no longer flinched at silence. He didn't praise her, but he didn't stop her either. Between them, there grew a kind of trust born not from kindness, but from need, the kind that survives only in cold places. One evening, the stove fire cast a soft orange over the cabin walls. Elias sat sharpening his knife, the sound steady, unhurried. Clara was darning socks by the window. Outside, wind moaned across the plains, dragging thin ghosts of snow across the ground. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked suddenly, not looking up. He paused, knife glinting in the firelight. "Tired of what?" "The quiet." He thought for a long moment. "The quiet's the only thing that doesn't lie." She didn't know what to say to that. Her fingers stilled over the thread, her chest tightening. Somewhere between his words, she felt the faint echo of her own loneliness, so vast it might have swallowed her whole if not for this silence they now shared. days melted into one another. Clara began to hum while she worked, small tunes from her girlhood. Elias never said he liked it, but sometimes she caught him listening, his knife work slowing just a little. She baked again, first out of habit, then out of joy. The smell of fresh bread filled the cabin, wrapping around them like something sacred. In those moments, the ache inside her eased, and she remembered who she'd been before grief hollowed her out. But the world has a way of noticing when hearts begin to heal. Gossip spread through Dustvale faster than spring thaw. By the time Clara rode into town for sugar and flour, whispers chased her like stray dogs. "She's living with him now," someone hissed. "No wedding band on that finger." Desperate thing. She kept her eyes forward, coins tight in her palm. Inside the general store, Hattie Griggs greeted her with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Well, if it isn't Mrs. Boone," Clara froze. "That's not my name." "Not yet," Hattie replied, voice honeyed with poison. "Still, folks talk. You know how winters are. Cold air breeds sharp tongues." Clara paid without a word and walked out. The bell above the door clanged behind her, harsh as judgment. When she returned to the ranch, Elias was repairing the fence. She set the supplies down and tried to speak lightly. "Seems the town's got plenty to say about us." He didn't look up. They always do. "Doesn't it bother you?" "No." His tone was flat, dismissive. But she saw the flicker in his jaw, the muscle tightening before he turned away. Something inside her sank. She'd hoped for one word of defense, a flicker of loyalty. Instead, there was only quiet. That night, they ate in near silence. The fire popped. Wind clawed at the shutters. She waited for him to say her name, to tell her the whispers meant nothing, that she belonged here. But when he spoke, it was only to ask for more coffee. After he went to bed, Clara sat alone by the hearth. Shame gnawed at her chest, raw and tender. She imagined her mother's voice, the one she hadn't heard since girlhood. "A woman's worth, Clara May, is the mirror others hold." But what if that mirror was cracked? What if she refused to see herself through it anymore? By morning, her decision was made. She folded her clothes neatly, packed her thread and thimble, wrapped the last loaf of bread. Elias was outside tending the horses. She stood in the doorway, the cold biting her face. "Mr. Boone," she called. He turned, snow-dusting his coat. "Thank you for giving me work." He frowned. "You're leaving. I can't stay where I make trouble for a man's name." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Words didn't come easily to him. They never had, and she didn't wait for them now. She turned, walking into the gray morning until his ranch disappeared behind the veil of falling snow. Hours later, as dusk fell over the plains, the wind shifted. Hot, wrong. Clara smelled smoke before she saw it. She turned back toward the horizon and froze. A dark column rose against the pale sky, thick and furious. The Boone Ranch. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Without thinking, she dropped her pack and ran. The snow sucked at her boots, the cold air cutting her throat. Flames bloomed against the horizon, swallowing the barn whole. She heard the panicked cries of horses, the crack of collapsing beams. "Elias!" she screamed, her voice breaking the storm's silence. He was there, barely visible through the smoke, trying to free the last horse from its stall. A beam fell, striking his shoulder, and he dropped to his knees. Clara didn't stop. She plunged into the fire, the heat stealing her breath, her shawl catching sparks. The smoke stung her eyes, but she found him, coughing, half-conscious. She grabbed his arm, heaved with everything she had, and dragged him out into the snow. They fell together just beyond the burning line, the world a blur of ash and wind. Elias tried to speak, voice ragged. "The horses, they're safe," she lied. She didn't know if it was true. She only knew he was alive beneath her hands. He blinked, the orange glow reflecting in his eyes. "You came back." Her voice trembled, half sob, half laughter. "No one marries a fat widow, sir," she whispered, echoing her own pain back to the night. "But she can love." The fire burned itself to silence. Snow began to fall again, soft and slow, landing on their smoke-streaked faces. For a long while, neither moved. The barn was gone, but the cabin stood, scarred but standing. Clara helped him inside, wrapped him in blankets, cleaned the blood from his forehead. His eyes stayed on her the whole time, searching for something neither of them had the courage to name. When dawn came, the world looked strange, half blackened, half new. The barn was a skeleton, but the air smelled of clean ash, as though something old had been burned away. Elias sat on the porch, arm in a sling, while Clara poured him coffee. The cup trembled in her hand. He steadied it gently. "You shouldn't have come back," he said. "I couldn't stay gone. After what they said," she smiled faintly. "They've been talking all my life. Let them keep busy." He watched her for a long time, then reached for her hand. His touch was rough, uncertain, but it stayed. "Guess I should build another barn," he said quietly. "I'll help," she answered. He nodded once, a small, tired smile ghosting across his lips. "I know." Spring arrived as if summoned by mercy. Grass pushed through the thaw, green and stubborn. Together they rebuilt what was lost, each hammer strike ringing like forgiveness. The town still talked, but now it was different. Little Jeb, the errand boy, came by with mail one morning and called her Mrs. Boone without thinking. Elias didn't correct him. Some nights, when the world was quiet and the sky blazed with stars, Clara would stand at the fence, breathing the scent of new grass and smoke. She'd remember the woman who'd walked through snow carrying shame like a shroud, and she'd realize that somewhere between the fire and the frost, that woman had burned away. What remained was someone new, someone unafraid of being seen. Elias would come up behind her then, not to speak, just to share the silence. His hand would brush hers, his warmth steady. They didn't need declarations. The air between them was enough. A promise made in the language of survival. The narrator's voice, if it were to drift through the wind, might have said, "Some hearts thaw slower than others, but when they do, they bloom enough for two." In the end, the town forgot its gossip. The snow melted, the fields filled with wildflowers, and the widow who once whispered, "I can work," now laughed freely beneath the sun. The world hadn't grown kinder. It simply couldn't touch her anymore. If you ever find yourself walking through a hard winter, remember her story. Remember that love does not arrive dressed in grandeur or promise. It comes quietly, through work-worn hands and shared silences, through those who see you not as burden but as belonging. And when spring finally comes, as it always does, let it find you ready, not waiting to be chosen, but choosing to rise. Subscribe for more Wild West tales.